Saturday, the 18th of July. In Iran Shah, in the center of the country, footage circulating from the past day shows what is described as the aftermath of strikes on the Iranian Army's 388th Mechanized Assault Brigade, with reports of significant casualties among its personnel. Some of the wounded are shown being carried toward a hospital associated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, while military checkpoints multiply on the roads leading into the city. It is a striking image, not because checkpoints are unusual in Iran's larger cities, where they have been a fixture since the January uprisings, but because Iran Shah is a comparatively small city, and the sudden buildup of security infrastructure there suggests the regime is bracing for something it did not expect to have to manage in a place like this. That single image, though, only makes sense against the backdrop of a rapidly shifting week of conflict, so it's worth backing up to lay out what has actually happened, and separating what is confirmed from what remains a claim made by one side or the other. Since the resumption of full-scale conflict roughly 2 to 3 weeks ago, U.S. Central Command has been conducting sustained waves of strikes against Iranian military infrastructure. According to a statement attributed to Central Command, a recent 7-hour wave of strikes hit dozens of military targets near the Strait of Hormuz and along Iran's coastal areas, using fighter aircraft, drones, and naval assets to launch precision munitions against missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, and coastal defense systems, with the explicit stated aim of degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping and civilian maritime crews. That wave coincided with the reimposition of a naval blockade against vessels transiting to or from Iranian ports, which Central Command says went into force at 4 in the afternoon Eastern Time on the day it was announced. What followed that statement marks a clear expansion in the kinds of targets being struck. Rather than continuing to focus solely on naval and air assets, reporting from the past day describes strikes moving onto Army barracks and infantry positions, including the reported near elimination of the 388th Mechanized Brigade in the checkpoints near Iran Shah. Separately, reports describe a senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps intelligence official, identified as Colonel Mohammad Nasser Devar, described as the head of IRGC intelligence for Iran's Khuzestan province, as having been killed in a strike attributed to U.S. Central Command forces in the southwestern part of the country, not far from the Kuwaiti and Iraqi borders. If accurate, that would represent a significant blow to Iran's regional intelligence apparatus, since provincial intelligence chiefs typically coordinate both domestic surveillance and, in Khuzestan's case, monitoring of a province with a substantial ethnic Arab population and a long history of unrest. It should be said plainly that this claim, like most individual casualty and elimination reports in an active war, comes from a single stream of reporting and has not been independently corroborated through multiple sources at the time of this account. There is also a reported incident from the southern port city of Bandar Abbas and the surrounding waters, where a Turkish-owned bulk carrier was destroyed, apparently breaking in half, near the Iranian coast. Accounts of what caused this vary. Some reports attribute it to a naval mine, consistent with mines that Iran's Revolutionary Guard naval forces have reportedly laid in parts of the Gulf. Iranian state channels reportedly claimed it resulted from striking a different vessel, though no second vessel has been identified or confirmed. The available evidence, according to those following the incident, points more toward an accidental mine strike than a deliberate attack, though this too remains an assessment rather than a confirmed fact. Turkey has not issued a detailed public response as of this account. Now, to the question of exactly where the operational picture stands, using only figures that have actually been attributed to specific sources, because loose approximation is not useful in a war zone, Admiral Brad Cooper, identified as the commander of U. Central Command is reported to have stated that over the preceding 7 days, Iran intentionally targeted civilian shipping across the region, attacking 7 commercial vessels and resulting in casualties, described as nearly a dozen civilian crew members killed, missing, or injured. That statement also describes continued Iranian missile and drone launches toward Gulf states and frames the American position as holding Iran accountable for what Cooper's statement calls unwarranted aggression endangering civilian lives. It's worth noting that a foreign worker, reportedly Indian, is separately reported to have been killed in the Strait of Hormuz area amid this activity, with additional Ukrainian nationals reported injured, though neither the Indian nor Ukrainian governments had issued formal public statements on these specific incidents as of this account, according to available reporting. On the retaliatory side, the picture over recent days shows Iran launching drones and missiles toward Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan. In Kuwait, Shahed 136 suicide drones are reported to have struck oil storage infrastructure, with at least one impact described as not intercepted, despite the presence of American-assisted air defense coverage. A separate strike is reported to have hit a warehouse in Kuwait. In Bahrain, Patriot air defense batteries, operating with American support, are reported to have intercepted the bulk of an incoming barrage of ballistic missiles, though this too rests primarily on official statements rather than independent verification. Jordan reported 4 ballistic missiles intercepted by Patriot systems over Amman, with at least 1 and reportedly 2 impacts affecting the vicinity of the King Faisal Air Base, alongside falling debris from intercepted missiles elsewhere. Taken together across Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, and earlier reported strikes, the number of missiles and drones actually causing confirmed impacts, as opposed to being intercepted or missing their targets, is described in available reporting as relatively small, likely under 10 distinct successful hits across all of these countries combined over the period in question. Whether that reflects effective air defense coverage, degraded Iranian precision guidance capability following weeks of strikes on missile infrastructure, or simply Iran choosing lower-value demonstration targets rather than committing its most capable systems, is a matter of interpretation rather than settled fact. One detail that deserves particular attention, because it changes how the entire regional picture should be read, is which countries have not been targeted at all in this phase. Israel has not been struck. Saudi Arabia has not been struck. The United Arab Emirates has, per available reporting, also largely been left alone, aside from being mentioned rhetorically. Read that again because it tells you something concrete about Iran's actual risk calculus rather than its public rhetoric. For decades, hostility toward Israel has been presented publicly by the Islamic Republic as a central pillar of its foreign policy. Yet in an active war against the United States with its own territory under sustained bombardment, Iran has avoided opening a front against Israel entirely. The most plausible reading, offered by multiple regional analysts, is that Iranian leadership understands a strike on Israel would very likely draw the Israeli military directly into the conflict in a much more forceful way than the current American-led campaign, and that this is a red line Tehran is not currently willing to cross, whatever its public statements claim about its ultimate ambitions. That brings us to a claim reported over the past day that deserves careful skeptical treatment rather than being repeated uncritically, because it illustrates exactly how wartime information can spiral. According to Iranian state media, a senior figure identified as Manouchehr Mottaki, described as a former Iranian foreign minister, now holding a political role, proposed that Iran's strategy should shift toward a ground assault on American military bases in Gulf Arab states, specifically naming Kuwait and Bahrain, with the stated objective of capturing American personnel, with one account attributing to him a target figure of around 100 U.S. soldiers taken as prisoners. This proposal, if accurately reported, would represent an extraordinary escalation, essentially proposing that Iranian ground forces cross into sovereign Gulf states to seize American service members. It is worth being direct about how to weigh a claim like this. There is, as of this account, no visible indication of actual military mobilization, troop movements, naval assault preparations, or logistics, consistent with a ground invasion of Kuwait or Bahrain, both of which host substantial American military infrastructure and, in Bahrain's case, the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. A political figure making a maximalist public proposal is not the same as a credible operational plan in Iran's own military posture throughout this conflict, avoiding Israel, avoiding Saudi Arabia, relying on drone and missile strikes rather than any visible troop buildup near Gulf borders, does not currently match rhetoric describing amphibious or ground incursions into neighboring states. That doesn't mean the statement is meaningless. Public maximalist rhetoric from officials during a losing military campaign often serves a domestic audience, signaling continued defiance to hardline factions inside the system, rather than describing an actual near-term plan. But treating it as an imminent invasion, rather than as a political statement whose real purpose is largely domestic messaging, would be an overstatement the evidence doesn't support. Let's move to what is happening inside Iran itself, because this is where the more consequential story may actually be unfolding. Multiple reports describe worsening blackouts across southern and western Iran, with outages reportedly affecting Khuzestan and Kerman provinces heavily, along with significant sections of Bandar Abbas, and intermittent disruptions, even reaching parts of Tehran. One widely circulated clip reportedly shows Iranian state television's own World Cup coverage cutting to black mid-broadcast due to a power outage, with the presenter attempting to make light of the interruption on air. Whatever its intended tone, the moment captures something larger. A state media apparatus struggling with the same basic infrastructure failures it is simultaneously trying to avoid acknowledging as a crisis to its own population. Alongside blackouts, reports describe continuing water shortages in Tehran and other major cities, a problem that predates this war, but has reportedly worsened under the combined strain of continued conflict and infrastructure damage. Iranian authorities are reported to be repeatedly urging citizens to conserve both water and electricity, a request that, set against a backdrop of state media continuing to broadcast defiant war messaging, creates a visible contradiction between the government's projected confidence and the lived reality being reported by residents. There's also reporting of renewed protest and organized resistance activity inside the country, though the scale remains, according to available accounts, well short of a mass uprising. One specific development reported over the past several days concerns the announced formation of what is described as a new armed resistance group, reportedly drawing members from political prisoners, families of those killed in the January uprisings, and residents of the Loristan and Bakhtiari regions in western Iran, declaring support for restoring what Iranian monarchists refer to as the Lion and Sun banner, a symbol associated with Iran's pre-1979 government. A video statement attributed to this group has reportedly circulated with subtitled translations. As with most claims about organized underground resistance networks inside a tightly controlled security state, independent verification of the group's actual size, capability, or coordination is extremely difficult from outside the country, and claims of this kind should be treated as reported assertions rather than confirmed operational facts. What can be said with more confidence, because it reflects a broader pattern rather than a single unverified claim, is that a meaningfully larger number of Iranians are reported to be armed compared to prior years, following periods of weapons distribution efforts described in earlier reporting on this conflict, though this remains far short of the scale needed to sustain anything resembling full civil conflict against the state's security forces. Reports describe sporadic, small-scale attacks, including nighttime shootings, targeting checkpoints, and Basij militia positions, alongside efforts by newly formed groups to organize and train, an inherently slow process for scattered, newly armed cells operating under constant surveillance risk, given the Revolutionary Guard's extensive history of infiltrating opposition networks over more than 4 decades. Security forces, for their part, are reported to be reinforcing checkpoints with heavier weaponry in anticipation of further unrest, rather than standing down. This is where 3 simultaneous pressures on the Iranian state become visible at once, and it is the convergence, rather than any single pressure alone, that appears to be driving the most significant recent development in this war. Signs of a shift toward negotiation. The military pressure is the most visible. Continued strikes against naval, air, and now army and intelligence infrastructure, a functioning blockade being enforced with live engagements against non-compliant vessels, and the reported elimination of at least 1 senior intelligence official. The economic pressure compounds this, blackouts, water shortages, and the broader strain of a wartime economy on ordinary businesses and households. And the psychological and political pressure includes both the visible cracks in state media's ability to maintain its narrative and the reported early stirrings of new resistance organizing inside the country. Against that backdrop, a genuinely significant statement is reported from Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, identified as the Speaker of Iran's parliament, who reportedly indicated Iran is now prepared to re-enter negotiations with the United States, despite the Islamic Republic having previously declared the earlier Memorandum of Understanding and Ceasefire framework void. According to Iranian state media as reported, Ghalibaf qualified this by stating that negotiation does not mean compromise, a distinction that matters less for its diplomatic content and more for what it reveals about internal politics. A senior official signaling openness to talks while simultaneously reassuring hardline factions inside the system that any negotiation will not be read as surrender. That kind of hedged, dual-audience statement is a familiar pattern in authoritarian systems under strain, where officials must speak to international counterparts and domestic hardliners in the same breath, and it should be read as evidence of an internal balancing act, rather than as a clear diplomatic opening on its own. It's worth being cautious here about one particular temptation in coverage of this war: the tendency to declare, based on any single conciliatory signal, that the conflict is effectively over, only to be contradicted days later by renewed strikes. This war has moved through pauses and escalations before, and there is no reliable indication that a single statement from a parliamentary speaker translates into an imminent ceasefire. The more accurate framing, consistent with how the conflict has behaved over recent weeks, is that pressure continues to build unevenly, punctuated by signals in both directions, rather than moving in a straight line toward either resolution or full-scale expansion. On the American side, the picture reported over recent days shows continued military operations without any public indication of scaling back, alongside a broader regional strategy that appears to extend well beyond Iran's borders. Reports describe Iraq's prime minister during a visit to Washington, indicating that Iran-aligned proxy forces operating in Iraq have been given a deadline, reported as the end of December, to disarm. This is described in available commentary as part of a broader, longer-running effort by Washington to pressure the wider network of Iran-aligned armed groups across the region simultaneously, reducing Hezbollah's position in Lebanon, pressuring the remaining Iran-aligned militias in Syria, continuing operations against Houthi forces in Yemen, and now setting disarmament terms for proxy groups in Iraq. Whether this amounts to a coordinated, centrally directed strategy to isolate Iran from its regional network of allied and proxy forces before intensifying pressure on Iran directly, as some regional analysts argue, or a set of loosely related, separately motivated policy moves that happen to be occurring in the same period, is an interpretation that current public reporting does not allow to be settled definitively. Now to the question of who might govern Iran if the current system were to collapse, because this has become a recurring theme in commentary on the war, and it deserves a clear-eyed treatment rather than a foregone conclusion presented as consensus. Iran's exiled crown prince, Reza Pahlavi, son of the last Shah before the 1979 revolution, has positioned himself for years as a unifying transitional figure for opposition movements, and continues to be referenced prominently in discussions of a post-Islamic Republic Iran. It is accurate to say he currently occupies a more prominent singular position among organized opposition figures than most rivals. It would not be accurate to present his eventual leadership or any particular political outcome for a post-regime Iran as settled or inevitable. Iran's opposition landscape includes multiple currents beyond monarchist supporters, and the country's political future, should the current system fall, would depend on a great many factors that cannot currently be forecast with confidence. The manner of any transition, who actually controls security forces and territory in a collapse scenario, and whether any transitional process is seen by ordinary Iranians as legitimate and homegrown rather than externally imposed. Analysts across the political spectrum have long cautioned that any transition perceived as installed or orchestrated from outside Iran, however well-intentioned, risks provoking exactly the kind of prolonged instability seen in other post-regime change states in the region over the past 2 decades, which is precisely why American officials, across multiple administrations and agencies, have consistently avoided publicly committing to installing any specific successor government or leader. So where does the honest assessment land as of today? The military balance continues to favor the United States decisively, with strikes now extending across nearly every category of Iranian military and security infrastructure, from naval and air assets to army ground forces, intelligence leadership, and, in at least the Chabahar case, police facilities. Iran's retaliatory capacity remains real but increasingly constrained in its targeting, concentrated against smaller, less defended Gulf states rather than against Israel or Saudi Arabia, a restraint that appears driven by fear of consequences rather than any lack of intent. Internally, the combination of infrastructure failures, economic strain, and small but growing organized resistance activity is placing sustained pressure on a system already managing an active foreign war. And now, for the first time in this recent escalation, a senior Iranian official has publicly signaled openness to renewed negotiations, even while immediately qualifying that signal to protect against domestic hardline backlash. None of this guarantees a particular outcome in the days ahead. The specific claim about a ground invasion plan targeting Gulf states remains, at most, a political statement without visible operational backing as of this account, and should not be treated as an imminent threat on the strength of a single reported comment. What is more consequential, and worth watching closely over the coming days, is whether Ghalibaf's negotiation signal develops into something concrete, whether the reported push toward regional proxy disarmament in Iraq continues to advance, and whether the newly reported resistance organizing inside Iran's western provinces proves durable or fades, as similar early-stage groups sometimes have, under the weight of infiltration and surveillance. The one structural risk that deserves to be named directly, separate from any single headline, is the danger inherent in a system under this much simultaneous pressure, military, economic, and internal, making decisions through a fractured internal process where hardline and more pragmatic factions are visibly pulling in different directions in public statements alone. A government speaking with 2 contradictory voices at once, one declaring readiness for negotiation, another proposing ground assaults on foreign military bases, is not necessarily a government moving toward a clear, coherent strategy in either direction. It is, more plausibly, a government under genuine internal strain, where different factions are competing to shape the next move without a single settled position. That kind of internal fragmentation, more than any individual battlefield development, is often what analysts who study wars like this one watch most closely, because it is precisely the condition under which miscalculation, whether an unauthorized strike, an unintended escalation, or a breakdown in whatever informal signaling channels currently exist, becomes most likely. Back in Iran Shah, the checkpoints reported in the footage from the past day remain in place, manned by security forces, bracing simultaneously against further American strikes and against unrest they cannot fully predict or control. Whether that image marks a turning point toward negotiation, toward further escalation, or toward something in between that has not yet fully taken shape, is not something that can be answered with confidence today. What can be said is that the range of pressures now converging on the Islamic Republic, military, economic, and internal, is broader and more sustained than at almost any point since this conflict resumed, and the coming days are likely to reveal considerably more about where this is actually heading than any single statement from any single official on either side.